Imagine walking into a royal court carrying a tiny bottle of perfume. It looks harmless, just a little glass container filled with fragrance. But in Renaissance Europe, perfume could be far more than something pleasant to wear. It could announce wealth, it could signal status, it could conceal unpleasant smells, it could become part of courtly seduction, and according to one of the most notorious stories surrounding the French royal court, it could even become associated with murder. The story centers on Catherine de' Medici and her Italian perfumer, René Le Florentin. Later accounts claimed that dangerous substances could be prepared and concealed in beautifully scented objects. Whether every detail of those stories was true is another question. But their survival tells us something important. People had begun to fear the invisible, because perfume itself was invisible. You could smell it, you could feel its presence, but you could not see what was actually floating through the air. And that mystery gave the perfume maker extraordinary power. For thousands of years, humans had been doing something strange with scent. They burned fragrant resins for gods. They covered their bodies in scented oils. Kings demanded rare, aromatic materials from distant lands. Merchants crossed deserts and oceans searching for ingredients. And eventually, craftsmen began guarding fragrance formulas as carefully as kings guarded treasure. But perfume's history is not simply the story of beautiful smells. It is the story of religion, trade, wealth, chemistry, war, animals, deception, memory, and human desire. The fragrance on a modern dressing table is the descendant of an industry that once depended on flowers picked by hand, rare materials brought across dangerous trade routes, secret techniques passed from master to apprentice, and luxury markets built around the desire to be noticed. And the strangest part is this: the perfume itself disappears. You spray it, it enters the air, minutes pass, the scent fades, yet somehow it can remain in someone's memory for decades. So how did something invisible become one of the most powerful luxuries humans have ever created? To answer that, we have to go back thousands of years, to a time when perfume wasn't worn at all. It was burned. The first perfumes were probably not perfumes in the modern sense. There were no designer bottles, no atomizers, no laboratories, no department stores. There was simply fire. Humans discovered that certain woods, resins, herbs, and other natural materials produced remarkable smells when burned. Smoke rose into the air, carrying their fragrance with it. And eventually, people began to notice something extraordinary. The smell could transform an entire space. A dark temple could suddenly smell of resin and spice. A religious ceremony could acquire an atmosphere unlike ordinary life. A burial chamber could be filled with aromatic substances. The discovery was simple, but its consequences were enormous. Scent became associated with the supernatural. In ancient civilizations, fragrant materials were frequently used in religious rituals. Frankincense and myrrh became particularly important in the ancient world. They were valuable not simply because they smelled pleasant, but because they were difficult to obtain. They came from regions far from many of the great civilizations that wanted them. That meant fragrance was already connected to trade. A person could burn something that had traveled hundreds or thousands of kilometers before reaching the temple. The farther the material traveled, the more extraordinary it could seem. And this created the first great relationship between perfume and power. Rulers could afford what ordinary people could not. Priests could control access to sacred materials. Merchants could profit from moving them. Fragrance, therefore, became part of the social hierarchy. The Egyptians pushed this idea further. Perfumed oils were used on the body, in religious ceremonies and in funerary practices. Scent became personal. It was no longer only something rising from a sacred fire. It could be carried on the skin. It could remain in someone's hair. It could be placed on clothing. It could surround a powerful person wherever they went. That changed the meaning of fragrance. A ruler could enter a room surrounded by a scent that ordinary people rarely encountered. The fragrance became part of the ruler's presence. And once scent became associated with powerful people, other people wanted it too. This is one of the oldest patterns in luxury history. Something begins as rare, the powerful acquire it. Others begin wanting it because the powerful have it. Demand increases, the rare thing becomes even more valuable. Perfume followed this pattern perfectly. But fragrance had another advantage. It was small. A large quantity of grain was difficult to transport. A large quantity of metal was heavy. But enormous value could be concentrated into a surprisingly small quantity of aromatic material. A merchant could carry valuable resin, oil, spice, or animal-derived fragrance material over long distances without needing an enormous caravan. That made perfume ingredients attractive commodities. Trade routes expanded. Fragrant materials moved between Africa, Arabia, Asia, the Mediterranean, and Europe. The history of perfume therefore became inseparable from the history of trade. But humans wanted more than smoke and oils. They wanted to capture the smell of flowers. That was much harder. Flowers are fragile. Their fragrance can change quickly after harvesting. Heat can damage delicate aromatic compounds. Different plants require different methods of extraction. The ancient perfumer therefore had to become part craftsman, part experimenter. He had to learn which materials worked together, which oils carried scent effectively, which ingredients lasted, which disappeared quickly, and which combinations produced something greater than the individual materials. This was the beginning of perfumery as an art. The perfumer was no longer simply using something nature had already made. He was composing, and once composition became important, knowledge became valuable. Two people might have access to the same flowers and oils but produce completely different results. One might create a fragrance that people remembered. The other might create something ordinary. The difference was knowledge. This would become one of the most important themes in perfume history. The raw materials mattered, but knowing what to do with them mattered even more. The Greeks and Romans inherited many fragrance traditions and expanded them. Perfumed oils became increasingly associated with bathing, social life, cosmetics, and luxury. Roman elites could perfume their bodies, clothing, homes, and public spaces. Fragrance became part of civilization itself, but luxury created competition. If everyone had the same fragrance, it could no longer demonstrate extraordinary wealth. So people wanted rarer materials, more exotic scents, more elaborate preparations, more impressive ways of displaying fragrance. Perfume became a form of invisible jewelry. Gold could be seen, jewels could be counted, fine clothing could be admired, perfume could not. Yet everyone could know that someone had entered the room. And that invisibility gave scent an unusual psychological power. It could linger after the person wearing it had disappeared. That meant fragrance could become associated with memory. The ancient perfumers did not understand modern neuroscience. They did not know why smell could become so strongly connected with emotion. But they could observe the effect. A particular fragrance could remind someone of a ceremony, a person, a place, a season, a powerful moment. Perfume was beginning to do something remarkable. It was turning an invisible sensation into a form of memory. But there was still a major limitation. The best materials were expensive, the best techniques were difficult, and the people who knew how to combine everything were becoming valuable. The perfumer was becoming more than a craftsman. He was becoming the keeper of knowledge, and eventually in the royal courts of Europe, that knowledge would become dangerous. By the Renaissance, fragrance had entered a new world. Europe's wealthy courts wanted perfume, but they wanted something more than ordinary pleasant smells. They wanted refinement. They wanted exotic ingredients. They wanted scents that distinguished one court from another. and Italy became an important center of perfume culture. Italian merchants had access to Mediterranean trade networks carrying spices, resins, oils, citrus materials, and other aromatic ingredients. The ingredients traveled, the techniques traveled, and eventually the culture of Italian perfumery traveled north. When Catherine de' Medici married Henry II of France in 1533, she brought Italian influence with her. Among the figures associated with her court was René le Florentin. Later legends gave him an almost sinister reputation. Stories connected him with secret preparations, poisons, and dangerous court intrigue. Some accounts are difficult to verify, others were undoubtedly exaggerated, but the legend reveals something historically important. Perfume had become associated with secrecy. Why? Because nobody outside the workshop necessarily knew what was inside the mixture. A perfumer could combine oils, herbs, resins, spices, and other substances. An outsider might recognize the final scent without understanding how it had been produced. That gave the perfumer control over information, and information was valuable. A successful fragrance could attract wealthy customers. A successful formula could create a reputation could create a business, and a business could create a fortune. So why would a perfumer reveal everything? He wouldn't. The knowledge could be passed from master to apprentice. Some formulas could be written down. Others could remain partly dependent on memory and experience. A master might know exactly when a material had reached the right condition. He might know how long to steep something, how much to add, when to stop. The written recipe might not capture the entire process. That meant the real formula could exist partly inside the mind of the perfumer. This was the original secret formula. But perfume secrecy was not only about competition, it was also about scarcity. Many fragrance materials were expensive because they were difficult to obtain. A rare flower might require enormous amounts of plant material to produce a small quantity of fragrant extract. A material from a distant country could be disrupted by war. A harvest could fail. A merchant could raise prices. The perfumer who controlled a reliable source had an advantage, and the merchant who controlled distribution had another. The industry was becoming a chain of power. Farmers produced, merchants transported, artisans extracted, perfumers composed, courts consumed. But fragrance had another role in Renaissance Europe. It could mask unpleasant smells. Cities were crowded, waste disposal was primitive, personal hygiene practices varied. And people had limited understanding of disease. Strong smells were often associated with danger or contamination. Perfumed oils, pomanders, scented gloves, and aromatic materials could therefore become part of everyday strategies for dealing with unpleasant environments. Perfume was no longer simply luxury, it was useful, and usefulness increased demand. But the same world that made fragrance valuable also made it mysterious. If someone became sick, people might wonder whether something poisonous had been hidden in a scented object. If someone died unexpectedly, suspicion could fall on anything unusual: a perfumed glove, a scented handkerchief, a bottle of oil. This does not mean perfume was routinely used as a murder weapon. The historical evidence does not support such a simple claim, but the possibility was believable enough for poisoning legends to become attached to famous courts. And those stories helped create perfume's aura of danger. The perfumer became a strange figure. Part artisan, part chemist, part merchant, part keeper of secrets. He could create something beautiful, but he also worked with substances whose properties were not fully understood. That ambiguity gave the profession power. Yet perfume was about to experience an even bigger transformation. It was going to leave the royal court, and when that happened, the perfume maker would no longer depend entirely on kings. He would depend on consumers. That change began in a place that would become synonymous with fragrance: grass. Grass's connection with perfume did not begin as elegantly as its modern reputation suggests. The town had long been associated with leatherworking, and leather has a problem. It smells. Tanning could leave unpleasant odors in finished leather, so artisans began using scented materials to improve the smell of their products. It was a practical solution, but practical solutions can sometimes create entire industries. The fragrance trade grew. Flowers became increasingly important. The countryside around Grasse offered suitable conditions for cultivating aromatic plants: rose, jasmine, lavender, orange blossom, tuberose. The landscape itself began changing. Fields became part of the perfume supply chain. Farmers grew flowers not simply because they were beautiful, but because their fragrance could be extracted and sold. This created an extraordinary relationship between agriculture and luxury. A flower that lasted only briefly in the field could become part of a perfume sold across Europe. But extracting its fragrance was difficult. Different materials required different techniques. Some could be distilled, others could be pressed. Some delicate flowers required gentler extraction methods. Every improvement mattered. Because the perfume industry had one fundamental problem: nature was unpredictable. A flower could produce a different quality of fragrance depending on weather, soil, harvest time, and other conditions. A bad harvest could raise prices, a war could interrupt imports, a disease could destroy crops. A perfumer might have a formula but lack the ingredients necessary to make it. This vulnerability would eventually make chemistry incredibly important. But before chemistry transformed the industry, Grasse helped establish something equally important: specialization. Farmers specialized in flowers, workers specialized in harvesting, processors specialized in extracting fragrance, perfumers specialized in composition, merchants specialized in distribution. The industry became more efficient, and once production became more organized, perfume could reach a larger market. Yet the old world of luxury remained. The finest natural materials were expensive. The most famous perfumers were associated with wealthy clients, and perfume still carried the aura of aristocratic sophistication. That would change dramatically in the 19th century. Chemists began identifying the compounds responsible for particular smells, and suddenly nature was no longer the only source of fragrance. This was the moment when the perfume maker's world was turned upside down. For thousands of years, the question had been, where can we find this smell? Now another question became possible. Can we build it? That was revolutionary. A perfume no longer had to depend entirely on nature. And once synthetic fragrance materials became available, the entire economic structure of perfume began changing. A scent could potentially be produced more consistently. Some expensive natural materials could be reduced or replaced. New combinations became possible, and the perfumer gained a larger creative palette. The old master perfumer had learned from flowers. The modern perfumer could learn from chemistry. That did not make natural ingredients irrelevant. Quite the opposite. Natural materials remained valuable because they provided complexity and character, but synthetic materials could provide precision and possibilities that nature alone could not guarantee. The perfume industry was becoming a hybrid of agriculture, craftsmanship, chemistry, and manufacturing. And this created a new kind of perfume maker. Not simply a craftsman, a designer, a scientist, an artist, a commercial strategist, but chemistry also threatened the old idea of the secret formula. If a perfume could be analyzed scientifically, then the formula was no longer completely mysterious. A rival could buy a bottle, study it, analyze its components, and attempt to reproduce the effect. The old perfume secret was weakening, so the industry needed a new form of protection, and it found one in the most powerful invention of the modern luxury market: the brand. The 19th century changed perfume more dramatically than almost any previous period. Chemistry was beginning to reveal what fragrance actually was. Instead of treating smell as mysterious magic, scientists could investigate the substances responsible for aromas. This opened a door. If a particular molecule created a recognizable smell, perhaps that molecule could be produced independently. One landmark example was coumarin. In 1882, perfumer Paul Parquet used synthetic coumarin in Houbigan's Fougère Royale. It helped create a new fragrance style rather than simply reproducing one particular natural flower. That mattered enormously. The perfumer was no longer limited to copying nature. Chemistry could help create new olfactory worlds. This changed the palette available to fragrance designers. Some synthetic molecules could make scents last longer. Others could produce effects that natural materials alone could not easily achieve. The perfume formula became more like a musical composition. Natural ingredients were instruments. Synthetic molecules were new instruments. The perfumer became the composer, and suddenly the possibilities multiplied. But there was a hidden consequence. Chemistry made perfume easier to imitate. The old master could protect his recipe by controlling knowledge. The modern laboratory could analyze the finished product. The secret was becoming less absolute, so perfume houses began protecting something different. The name, the bottle, the reputation, the story, the customer relationship. This is where modern perfume truly became a luxury industry. Consider Chanel No. 5. When it appeared in 1921, it was not simply introduced as a mixture of fragrant ingredients. It became associated with Gabrielle Chanel. The name became memorable. The bottle became recognizable. The fragrance became connected to a particular idea of modern femininity. This was a new kind of secret. The company no longer needed customers to believe that nobody could ever discover the ingredients. It needed customers to believe that no other fragrance could mean the same thing. That distinction transformed everything. A competitor could produce a similar scent, but could it reproduce the Chanel name? Could it reproduce the history? Could it reproduce the cultural associations? Could it make the same customer feel that she was entering the same world? Not easily. The perfume industry's greatest defense was becoming psychological, and advertising became the weapon. Perfume commercials rarely explain chemistry. They sell emotion. A mysterious woman, a glamorous man, a romantic encounter, a beautiful landscape, a famous face. The message is rarely, this perfume contains these ingredients. Instead, the message is, this is who you could become. Perfume became a tool of identity. A fragrance could be sophisticated, seductive, rebellious, powerful, youthful, elegant. The customer was invited to choose a personality. This was an extraordinary commercial development. The ancient world had used perfume to display status. The modern world used perfume to construct identity. But chemistry created another important advantage: scale. Natural flowers could be harvested only so quickly. Factories could operate continuously. Synthetic ingredients could be produced in controlled quantities. Glass bottles could be manufactured industrially. Packaging could be standardized. Distribution could expand. Perfume could move from the aristocratic palace to the department store. And once ordinary consumers could afford fragrance, the perfume industry became enormous. But mass production created a contradiction. If everyone could own perfume, how could perfume remain luxurious? The answer was to make the experience feel exclusive. Luxury packaging, prestigious names, limited editions, celebrity endorsements, high prices, elegant stores. The liquid might be produced on an industrial scale. The story surrounding it could still feel private. That was the genius of modern perfume. The industry learned that scarcity did not always have to exist in the physical product. It could exist in perception, and that would become more important than almost anything inside the bottle. Perfume had begun as something rare. Now it was becoming something global. Factories produced fragrance at unprecedented scale. Railways and ships moved ingredients and finished products across continents. Department stores placed perfume in front of millions of consumers. Advertising turned bottles into symbols, and fashion houses realized that perfume could extend their influence far beyond clothing. A dress could only be worn in certain situations. Perfume could be worn every day. It became one of the most profitable ways for a luxury brand to enter a consumer's personal life. And the psychology was simple. People wanted to smell distinctive, but they also wanted to smell desirable. That gave perfume a special position between fashion and intimacy. You wore it for yourself, but other people experienced it too. It became a social signal that could not be seen. And because it could not be seen, people often associated it with personality. This helped perfume become one of the world's most enduring luxury categories. But the global industry was built on a massive invisible network. Flowers had to be cultivated. Ingredients had to be harvested. Chemicals had to be manufactured. Glass had to be produced. Bottles had to be filled. Boxes had to be printed. Products had to be shipped. Stores had to sell them. Advertising campaigns had to create demand. The tiny bottle on a dressing table could therefore represent an enormous industrial system. The customer saw the final result. They rarely saw the workers and resources behind it. This was one of the industry's greatest illusions. Perfume looked personal. The business behind it was global, and the ingredients themselves could come from extraordinary places. Some fragrances depended on roses from specialized growing regions. Others relied on jasmine, citrus, lavender, woods, resins, spices, and historically some of the most prized perfume materials came from animals: musk, civet, ambergris. These materials introduced another chapter in the history of fragrance, because beauty had a price, and sometimes the price was paid by nature. Musk, historically obtained from male musk deer, became one of the most prized perfume materials. Civet came from animals known as civets. Ambergris was associated with sperm whales and could acquire value after undergoing changes in the ocean. These materials were powerful and difficult to obtain. Their rarity made them valuable, but their use also created ethical and ecological problems. As demand increased, the pressure on natural sources increased. That is why perfume may be one of the most psychologically powerful luxuries humans have ever created. It is temporary by nature, permanent by association. The perfume industry spent centuries protecting formulas, guarding ingredients, controlling trade, and creating myths around the bottle. That is the true history of perfume, not the history of something humans created to smell good, the history of something humans created to be remembered.